morning, my name is Megan Kaminsky, and today I will be discussing to what extent have video games participated in the evolution of American pop culture. So I read these articles, The Stimulus from Video Games and Education by Kurt Squire, who is a professor at the University of California and is renowned for his work in games and design, and David Schaffer in Video Games and the Future of Learning, and he is also a professor in child psychiatry. And I was reading these articles, and it was very interesting to see the fact how they talk about education, and more importantly, how it affects the future of our education. And that interests me in the fact that the way we learn and the way that we do these things through video games, how does it affect our everyday lives? In our everyday lives, what we do, how we work, can be defined as our popular culture. And that is what brought me to ask the question, how do video games affect our pop culture? So to begin with, video games have massively impacted the way that we socialize. And this can be most commonly seen in the advent of MMOs, otherwise known as massively multiplayer online games. And that's because people will go on these games and they have to work together to complete a common objective, to win the game. And this brings players together to, quote Kurt Squire, through competing in the game. And it really creates these robust gameplay communities. And through this, while they work together and such, they develop a set of effective social skills. One example would be League of Legends, a huge MMO game that has 60 million, over 67 million players, and they have gone on to develop their own lingo, such as words such as feeding, which describes a player who keeps getting killed by the other team, therefore strengthening the other team, and words such as fat, which describes a player who is very powerful and has taken many kills. And this, we can see how all of this really impacts how we socialize with one another, especially digitally and online. Now, there are many people who believe, to quote Kurt Squire again, that this really creates a kind of lone teenager who, isolated from society, and would serve to juxtapose the argument. However,
excuse the interruption. Seniors, the Navy recruiter Blair will be in the cafeteria third hour during all 3 lunch periods. If you are interested, please stop by and talk with him. Thank you. Bye.
To continue, many would argue that that there's a stereotype, and it's a factual stereotype, that video games really create like lone teenagers and such, and would really serve as a detriment to socialization as a whole. However, it's not just digitally that people are being brought together with these large MMOs. They're also they're being connected digitally, but it's also bringing them together in the real world as well. And we can see that in the multitude of gaming expos, Comic-Cons, to just downright going over to a friend's house to play video games. The way we interact, socialize, and play is completely different. And you can see that for the Salt Lake Comic-Con, the Guinness World Record was broke with 1,784 participants alone. And that's just for the specific everyone who came in a costume. So the involvement has really changed, and therefore our culture has seriously changed with the creation of video games. Moving on from that, from an economic standpoint, video games have really served to change culture there as well. One of the prime examples would be Pokemon, which started in 1996 with their first game, Red and Blue, and it still continues today and is a huge proponent of our culture today, because it really has evolved from a video game into a cultural phenomenon, to quote Video Games and Education, and it has really gone on to become giants in youth culture, because these kids, especially since these video games are marketed to children, they're games for children, these children grow up with these games, and it goes on, it rapidly affects the culture, because you're starting off with the kids, so they grow up and the culture evolves from there. However, many gamers contend that these games are flops, or are just downright, like Pokemon Go, that maybe they're just not that great, not really that much a part of the culture. However, the game is still played today by millions of people. It still updates regularly and is still a very major effect on our culture as we see it today. Moving on from that, video games have actually had quite a large historical impact on our culture. This begins actually back in the 1960s and 70s, in which computers were only really found in universities and other such big organizations. They weren't really available to the public because most people, the things that a computer would be like a necessity, most people already had telephones, calculators. They didn't really need computers. They were just kind of an unnecessary thing. However, with the introduction of video games into the picture, it created kind of a use for the computer. So that starts in Ralph Baer's Magnet's Odyssey in 1972, brought computer technology to the home for the first time. They actually, in Texas Instruments home computer, they actually came with cartridge slots to play the video games in the computer itself. So it really helps change our culture, because if we hadn't have had that, if we hadn't have had video games, we might not have had computers quite like the way we do today. And granted, some people would argue that computers inevitably would have, become part of our everyday lives. However, to quote again, it might have otherwise been more difficult becoming established from the get-go. So we might have had computers quite the way we do today if we hadn't had that. So to conclude, video games have massively participated in the evolution of our pop culture because it has affected the way we socialize, what we buy, what we consume and produce economically. It has also historically impacted us because the way we operate today, the computers, our technology, it might have been completely different otherwise. And I think that is something to embrace, really, our culture and how it has changed.